I'm very pleased to introduce David Carrier, whose works are well known also, very well known also in Italy. His works, especially his work about philosophy of art and aesthetics. And David worked on many different topics in aesthetics and philosophy of art. Between his many books, I would like to remember here some titles. Art, Charles Baudelaire and the Origin of Modernist Painting, The Aesthetics of Comics, Proust and Warhol, World Art History and its Object, and finally, is for common publication, co-author with Joaquim Pizarro, titled Wild Art. I would like to read a short paragraph from the cover of his book. Wild art is the vast proliferation, like wild vegetation, of art forms that occur behind the perimeters of what we call the established art world, or the art system. These are forms of art that tend to escape the attention of art experts, art academics, art curators, art critics. They fall short of catching the eyes or the ears of cultural channels. This is an introduction to the vast number of wild creative forms that proliferate outside the well-governed art world. I think that the short paragraph from the abstract of David forthcoming books led me to think that to one of the most important sources of inspiration of the philosophy, that is the thoughts and the friendship of Arthur Dantos, who has a particular bond with Italy and especially with Turin. For all these reasons, I am really happy and honored that David is here today. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I thank Professor Tiziana Andina for making this occasion possible. She and I share a passion for the writings of my teacher, Arthur Danto. 30-some years ago, I came to Turin, my previous visit to Turin, to meet him at a conference. I returned today to speak in part about his aesthetic theory. How much I wish he could be with us today. This lecture has two parts with two distinct PowerPoint presentations. First, I present the story of this project, Wild Art, and then I show some of our many examples. We probably won't have time to get through all those, but we can do a sampling anyway. I discuss a project which has consumed much of my life for the past 5 years, a collaboration with Joaquim Pizarro. We are interested, as was said, in the forms of art outside the art world, which we dub wild art, meaning art which is not domesticated by the rules and regulations of the art world institutions, the gallery and the museum. Our co-authored book, Wild Art, is forthcoming in September from Phaidon. The first printing is 50,000 copies, an audience ranging far beyond the typical readership for academic books. Our claims are ambitious and far-reaching. One good way to understand our argument is to learn how it developed. The book is important enough, I believe, there is legitimate interest in its genesis. Tom Wolfe anticipated our concerns, and when I show these PowerPoints, I won't read them because it always seems more economical to do it this way, in an essay a few decades ago. But neither he nor anyone else worked out our radical argument. So Wolfe here talks about these forms of what we call wild art, all these cultural manifestations that are outside the art world, outside the institutional framework. For many years, I've had the privilege of lecturing at an extraordinary institution, the Studio School on 8th Street in Manhattan. Some years ago, I organized a panel on critical disagreement. Critics often disagree, but rarely do they work out their disagreements face to face. And so much could be learned, I thought, by talking through disagreements with images of the art in question on display. I selected examples which were then debated by a group of critics, including Pizarro. Facing disagreements can be uncomfortable, and so I was a little nervous. But the debate was instructive, and Pizarro and I continued that discussion. This is one of the starting points of our book. This is a collaborative project, and the way that we developed it as a collaboration was anticipated by Pizarro's exhibition here at MoMA 2006, and by a book that is a product from his doctoral dissertation. The book is called Cezanne Pizarro, Johns Rauschenberg, Comparative Studies on Intersubjectivity in Modern Art. He's interested in that book in two artist couples, his great-grandfather and Cezanne, and then two people that he knew, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg. And the theory of the book is that these artist pairs were able to become boldly original because they shared a language. If at the start only one person understands what you say, that can be enough. The broader audience comes later. Now, it's important, in thinking about Pizarro here, whose early training was in France, that before he moved to England and studied at the Courtauld, that his mentor was Todorov, and what particularly concerned him was that writer's defense of Enlightenment values. So this exhibition contains some of this argument, and it's a quite extraordinary idea. Imagine having your doctoral thesis being presented as an exhibition at MoMA. Nice start, okay? The subtitle of the show is Origins, Two Foreigners, the Formation of a New Language in Painting. Now, foreigners because Camille Pizarro was born in the West Indies, and Cezanne is Provençal born and was seen as a foreigner in Paris. And in the catalog, Pizarro describes his great-grandfather's anarchism. Quote, and you can see the pair, Cezanne and Pizarro and Camille Pizarro. This is quoting Pizarro. The modern individual artist was autonomous. His law came from within. He knew no God, no master, no school. In the artistic realm, this individual was an impressionist. In the political realm, he was an anarchist. Pizarro, that is Camille Pizarro, saw absolutely no contradiction between the two. The artists contribute then to a language together, and again quoting Pizarro, each in turn gives and takes, each learns from and teaches the other. In the end, neither plays just one part, and certainly neither of them can be seen as either a master or a disciple. Now, Rauschenberg and Johns also functioned at one early point in their life as collaborators. Lovely photo of them here. When collaboration works, two people together do something which neither of them could have accomplished on their own. This process demands challenging emotional intimacy. Your collaborator sometimes will press you on, but on occasion must tell you that what you have just said is wrong or wrong-headed. It depends then on the tensions created by different backgrounds. When you have highly original ideas, it's easy to believe that maybe you're merely crazy. Having even one collaborator who validates your way of opinion can make a big difference. For a very long time, I was very close to Danto. I know his ways of thinking inside out, and have on occasion contributed a little to their development. But this emotional intimacy is not collaboration, for the basic terms of discussion were his, and my role was to explore their consequences. The relationship with Pizarro is totally different. You might think of models here. Opera composers need their librettists. Mick Jagger needed Keith Richards. And there are even collaborations among writers, Deleuze and Guattari, or a fictional example, if you think in Flaubert's novel of Bouvard and Pécuchet. We noted these precedents, Joachim and I, as we developed our process, though it would be too self-conscious to think about those all the time. Let me say a little bit about this collaborative process before we get to the argument proper here. When alone I scan the world, the people close to me, the buildings at a distance, my attention inevitably dispersed. But when close to a beloved friend, I may focus totally on that person. Then the world's not even background. For whatever the visual reality, I am in total contact with another. No wonder looking at art is powerful, for then, too, attention is concentrated. When you have this total relationship with another person, then you become something more than an isolated self. This opening up means that suddenly I am with another, and so my mental experience expands. Thoughts lose their identity as my thoughts. They become articulated as shared. And then magically I hear them in a way that I hear myself. It's not that I'm in contact with another, but I become something more than my mere impoverished self. It's not simply that I'm interested in another's judgment, which may differ from mine. It's rather that it's our judgment that emerges in a sharing in which dividing up of who said what makes no sense. All of this maybe has something to do with love. Love is a total relationship, access to a life, to a person. No doubt it's an illusion, but it is a productive illusion. Now, that analysis may be obscure. What matters certainly is that Joachim and I were prepared to collaborate, that we came from very different backgrounds. Though wild art builds on collaboration, it's not something that's explicit in Kant, but it is, collaboration was a part of his life. His biographer, Manfred Kuhn, notes, quote, he was a very gracious and social being, not so much the solitary, isolated, and somewhat comical figure that many have come to see in him. His critique, Kant's critique, was born of dialogue, something that the large rule of dialectic in it should have made very clear. Aesthetic judgments must be shared. This is the Kantian idea. It's not just that they happen to be social. The genesis of the aesthetic judgment is social. I judge freely on my own, but I try to persuade others my aesthetic judgments link me to other people. The crucial notion here is Kant's phrase about common sense, not common sense in the everyday English sense of it, but as the common human understanding, quoting Kant, a faculty for judging that in its reflection takes account of everyone else's way of representing in order to hold its judgment up to human reason as a whole. When I judge for myself, I judge for everyone, which is to say that my judgment has to abstract from my personal limitations. And these are the Kantian maxims that I show. Now, let's look at some art. For a long time, the art world has thrived on bringing into the galleries objects from outside. Richard Tuttle's 3-inch string here, shown in enlarged image, or Jeff Koons's kitsch sculpture, are examples much discussed. Recently at MoMA, near the entrance, Tilda Swinton was sleeping in a glass case in a performance. It's revealing about philosophers that I happened to go there a little sleepy. I hadn't had my coffee. I didn't know what I was going to see. I walked around and it took me sort of 35 seconds to say, oh, it's a performance. All right? Now, this is how we look at the art world, right? That we see it, we know it's going to be interpreted because it's in the art gallery. If you look at the history of contemporary art from within, there have been a succession of revolutions. Impressionism to Cubism to Surrealism to Abstract Expressionism and so forth. And this is what Danto's Aesthetics discusses. A definition of art must include everything accepted by the art world. And of course, the classic example here is going to be the Brillo box that Danto has much discussed. So, Danto's analysis asks, how can an ordinary object like a Brillo box enter the art world in which, when it enters, it becomes something other than the mere physical object? There is, however, the second question: what is aesthetic experience? These are distinct questions. Kant focuses on the second. If you seek a definition of art, then, as Danto notes, you'll find Kant's third critique disappointing. Hegel concentrates on the first question, and since that's also Danto's concern, he can present himself as Hegel's legitimate successor. Danto is interested exclusively in what's within the art world, that is, what is art. We, Pizarro and I, are interested in the relationship of what's inside and what's outside the art world. Danto offers a definition of art. We critique any attempt to distinguish between art world art and wild art. In principle, then, Danto's different concerns need not conflict with ours, but in practice, the different focus here means that dialogue with him can be difficult. If you think that defining art is important, then you need something like his necessary and sufficient conditions. But if, as we claim, the boundaries between the art world art and everything else are constantly shifting, then searching for those conditions may be beside the point. Now, let's look at Danto's analysis here. This is in one of the later books, the Mellon Lectures from 1996. As he's acknowledged, the necessary and sufficient conditions here are not completely satisfactory, because those conditions include some kinds of things that are not art. One example would be an Armani suit, which is about prestige and embodies that meaning. Another example from the other end of the world would be the punk haircut. It's about transgression and embodies that meaning. But presumably, those sorts of artifacts are not art, though it seems that they fit the definition. Now, Danto's talked about this point. He's not especially worried. His definition is a good start. And philosophers, their job is to fix up the definition. So what he needs on the definition here is a third condition that would exclude things like clothing and punk hair. Okay. Danto's concern defining art is not really the concern of the art historian, sort of outside of art history. It's not the concern for us, because we don't think that there's any real distinction between art and wild art, though we think that people do maintain that distinction. So we agree with Danto that in principle anything could enter the art world, as again a great example here, but we draw a different lesson from that fact. Now, let's talk about that. In the past 30 years, the leading American museum, MoMA, has changed a great deal in what it shows. Instead of foregrounding color field paintings or sculptures like the Anthony Caros here, now it focuses on Cindy Sherman's photographs or Gordon Matta Clark's deconstructed buildings like here. So it looks like a very dramatic change, and obviously the job of the art historian is to explain how did we get from objects like this modernist sculpture to objects like the Matta Clark building. But if you look at the art world from outside, the history will look different. Because at every point in this history, there's been a firm distinction between what's inside the art world and what's outside. So, while a great deal has changed, going from here to here, in a sense, not so much has changed. Now, how do we want to understand that? The contemporary world changes. Lost a slide there. Ooh, lost a bunch. Out of order. Let me talk about this example here. Look at how change functions in our world. A movie from my youth, Antonioni's Blow Up, 1966. The very privileged photographer, David Hemming here on the right, has in his Rolls Royce a telephone. And this is presented as a great luxury. It's the cumbersome version of the iPhone that we all have now, much more accessible. So we live in a culture of super rapid change, and institutions that don't change quickly get in trouble. When the technology changes, the rest of the world changes too. So there is a desire within the art world that change come very, very quickly, that we move, as I showed in those examples from MoMA, from the older to the newer things very quickly and very relentlessly. But how do we understand that change? Now, here I start to focus a little on aesthetic judgments. Danto makes a subtle, easily misunderstood point, that Brillo box differs in kind from the identical Brillo box in the grocery. So the whole point of Danto's analysis, skipping some examples there, is to explain how this work of art in the gallery differs from the same thing that look at essentially the same sort of thing you could find in a grocery. Now, we want to look at different questions. We want to talk about the distinction between art and wild art. Now, to do that, we need to talk about aesthetic judgments. Now, let me show an example here that's very familiar to me because I've published a couple of books about Poussin. Art historians study Poussin. They give you information. I mean, I can tell you an awful lot about this painting that's in the Met in New York, Blind Orion, because that's what Poussin scholars do. But nothing I can tell you tells you how to judge it aesthetically, because many people like it. Some do not. It's a gawky painting. It's awkward. It's a little cumbersome. Perhaps it's not interesting at all. Now, let me make a similar point about contemporary art, because a lot of contemporary art, at least in America, is heavily built around theories. When you read Art Forum, or certainly October, there's elaborate philosophical machinery, lots of footnotes and so forth, and you get a sense that you're caught in a technical discipline. But in the end, you have to judge for yourself. No one can make an aesthetic judgment for you, even if you want them to. As a critic, I make forceful judgments. I try to be as persuasive as possible. But I know that other people will have different points of view. That's simply the nature of aesthetic judgment. Now, I want to say a little bit more about this because this will get us, I think, into what Pizarro and I want to say in our polemical history. Now, I want to do this by talking about one of the best-known essays about modernism by the American critic Clement Greenberg that invokes Kant in an interesting and strange way. Now, Greenberg wants to explain the difference between master art, let's say here, and modernist art here. And he gives the following analysis. Quoting Greenberg, "The old masters created an illusion of space and depth that one could imagine oneself walking into. But the analogous illusion created by modernists, as here in Matisse, can only be seen into, can be traveled through literally or figuratively only with the eye." Now, Greenberg then adds an interesting point. He appeals to Kant. He says, Kant was the first real modernist because he was self-critical. That is, he used the means of criticism itself to criticize the very activity. Kant was self-critical within philosophy in a way that the modernist painters like Matisse are self-critical in painting. So the old masters here, they simply painted, whereas the modernist painter paints self-critically. Now, this is a strange analysis, It's been much criticized, of course, by American critics, and I want to use it here as a starting point to take to the polemical analysis that Pizarro and I are going to have. Now, philosophers, you all know Kant's two basic points. Aesthetic judgments are not governed by rules, and they are made as if valid for everyone. So, when I say that something pleases me, I call it beautiful, as if that quality were a property of the object, even though in a sense it's a property of my experience. Aesthetic judgments cannot be rule-bound. I admire painting and you don't, we can debate, but nothing you say can show me that I am necessarily wrong. Suppose we have a sociological theory, as French philosophers have done. Well, even if everyone in the world but me says that a painting is great and I disagree, that doesn't show that I'm wrong. We simply have disagreement. It's interesting the way people talk about this. When Pizarro and I did the lecture at the studio school, a famous art historian said, well, everyone knows Michelangelo is a genius. And that was meant to be sort of a reply. Well, every Michelangelo, this is an interesting one because it's a very early one that's recently been rediscovered that the Kibble Museum in Texas purchased. Now, is that a work of genius? I don't know. It's an interesting painting because it's a Michelangelo. Within the art world, there's a certain pressure to not admitting to non-standard tastes. I found out as a young critic when I spoke of admiring Baltus in the 1980s that was incorrect. Greenberg uses Kant's notion of self-criticality as the basis for a normative theory of modernism. There is the good modernist art, which is self-critical, like Picasso here doing Cubism, and the bad stuff, like the Russian socialist realist painting here, which is kitsch. So it's very interesting, Greenberg's reasoning, and you can see that it just has to be wrong, because he has a Kantian theory of modernism that says, well, here we got the good stuff, which is self-critical, and here we have the bad stuff, like the socialist realism, Rapin, which is not self-critical, which is easy. Now, we know this can't be right because Kant says there are no criteria, right, for aesthetic judgments. Kitsch is a non-concept. It designates, it functions as a kind of logical engine. It offers a buffer or a fence to separate out what's not high art. It's a kind of moralistic account. Kitsch is low, it's bad for your mental and almost your moral health. High art is good. And think of how the descriptions in English for kitsch: garish, vulgar, facile, tacky, lowbrow, seducing, crowd-pleasing, commercial, over the top. And recently the term spectacle. Well, a lot of ways of all of saying that it's not good. Now, Kant's scholars offer elaborate accounts of the aesthetic judgment in relation to his system, but that's not what really Pizarro and I want to focus on. We want to use his analysis polemically to look at the history of art history. Now, you know, I think, how these histories go. Kant identified the importance of aesthetic experience, but there he was, stuck in Königsberg in East Prussia in 1790. What could he know about art? He didn't see any art, he didn't see any art museums, he had little experience of art. And so aesthetics gets developed in the 1820s when Hegel historicized Kant and prepared the way for art history in the art museum. A friend walked me through Berlin, and it's great because on one hand you can see where Hegel's office was in the 1820s, and across the street you can see where the Schinkel Museum was being built, which of course was a Hegelian palace for art history. So here we have the Schinkel, And here we have Hegel offering a history of painting. And this history is really quite wonderful. I owe it to Dento to get me to reflect on this analysis. Because here in the 1820s in Berlin, we have all of art history since then. The best part of Hegel in those lectures, they're student notes. Imagine any one of us, if our reputation depended upon lectures that after our death our students assembled, who knows what we'd find. The best part of the lectures are the lectures on Dutch art. Hegel had been to the Low Countries, and he gives a kind of that gives a kind of life to this part of it. And in particular, you see, I love this beautiful phrase here where he's looking at the Dutch art. Now, the gist of the analysis is very simple. You might look back at the other quote, that the Renaissance Italians were Catholics. They painted Catholic courtly art. The Dutch of the Golden Age were bourgeois Protestants, and they painted a different sort of art. A different culture implies a different kind of art, a different kind of cultural expression. This is very beautiful analysis. It doesn't offer any examples, but you can see how you can look at the Hook and think of that, or Vermeer was only rediscovered later on, but you can see how Hegel would look at the Vermeer at the view of Delft and think, well, here we have a form of cultural expression. Now, two things have happened then already in the 1820s. First, we have art history developed. It's because the Hegelian idea is really that the culture changes. You have a different kind of cultural expression. You have a different kind of art. You can't compare Raphael to Vermeer because they are different cultures and they have different forms of expression. That's the art history. The second thing is you have the art museum. And the aim of the art museum is to show the history of cultural expression, the different forms of art. Now, Hegel, of course, had limited taste, but later commentators extended this to other art forms. The American, Ernst Fenollosa, extended it to Japanese art. Hegel was studied by Fenollosa at Harvard in the 1860s, and then when he went off to Japan and built a collection, he simply said, well, Japan expresses the Buddhist culture in its art. So the Hegelian idea is a very rich one. You can even do it, you see, to talk about contemporary art. There's an Australian-American critic, Terry Smith, who talks about contemporaneity, and quoting a little bit from him, it's the fundamental condition of our times. That is, it's a contemporaneity, being contemporary is a technical term in Smith's writing. It is the form of contemporary art here and now. So what Smith in effect says is there's the good stuff, which is contemporary, and then the other things you see going on that, though they're being made right now, are not contemporary and therefore are not interesting art forms. Now, we all know, of course, that everything's being made. I mean, there are people painting icons, right? But if you paint an icon, well, you're not dealing with contemporaneity. You're doing something else. Similarly, you see if you're painting a socialist realist painting or any other multitude of things. Now, if you look at this very rich history we've sketched, then, hey, Kant's account seems very bare. But if you look back to Kant, you say, well, in a way, the art history and the art museum are all wrong, because what these institutions presuppose is that aesthetic judgments are objective. That is, for Greenberg, we have the good stuff called modernism and the bad stuff called kitsch, and it's an objective distinction. And for all of his successors, including, you see, Terry Smith, Well, they change the terms, but always they make this moralizing distinction. There is the contemporaneity, which is the good, and there's the other art being made, which is not good because it doesn't deal with those cultural conditions. So, what Pizarro and I stress is that though it looks like there's been enormous change, in a way, you see, the art world has remained the same. Why? Well, the canon brings stability to our aesthetic judgments. You need some principle of order. Art comes into the art world and it goes out, but you have this would-be continuity. Now, we think that trying to create stability is hopeless. It's like trying to build a stable sandcastle near the water's edge when the tide is rising. But here we want to tell a story about our project. A few years ago, Pizarro and I were dining out at a small French restaurant in Manhattan called Bouffe à la Mode. And there you can see typical restaurant art on the right wall. Now, normally, art historians are trained not to look at this art because we all know that restaurant art is not serious. It's restaurant art. I mean, except in maybe in very grand restaurants. On this occasion, you see, we started to look at it. We looked at this painting and we said, well, it's sort of interesting. You know, we can compare it to other sorts of art forms. We can treat it as if it belonged somewhere else. Then we started to think about other examples. Here's some more restaurant art. It's from a restaurant in Manhattan. It's revealing because it's in a restaurant on 54th Street, directly across the street from the Museum of Modern Art. You've never heard of this artist, Dean Cornwell. It's murals. It's the life of Sir Walter Raleigh from 1930s. Now, although it's right across the street from MoMA, it's unlikely that Cornwell will be given a show there, even though surely many people from MoMA have, you know, dined in front of the art. It'd be a natural place to go. So, when Pizarro and I got going, we were interested not just in what's in the museum, but everything that could be found outside. Could be found outside the museum. This is what we call the wild art. When we started to think about that, we wondered about how to present it. And this is sort of interesting. 20 years ago in art history, when you did a lecture, you worked in a slide room, mostly had museum art. You could have photos made, but mostly you had museums. But now, with PowerPoint, in a way, as we say in English, the playing field is level. That is, you can move from Renaissance paintings to tourist photos to photos from the news to video images. You can move at anything. You can look at graffiti. You can look at tattoos, food art, or trash art. You see all the things, and this is the cover of our book, that you can find out in the world. Now, I show the book here, and in a minute I'll talk a little about the examples. The book has 480 examples, and gathering those was an intricate task, and they're all presented in color, so I took the resources of a major publisher. And in the second part here, this afternoon, I'll give a bunch of those examples. It's a little easier to work with the PowerPoint than the book, because in the PowerPoint you don't have to worry as much about copyright. But I want to say a little bit more about the analysis here in the purely philosophical part of our discussion, and say a little bit more about Kant here. Now, Kant's aesthetics, if you think about the timing, it's really interesting. The third critique appears in 1790. 3 years later, what happens, during the end of the French Revolution, the Louvre is open to the public. And this is a massive cultural exchange. It is true that there were public museums in Italy before then, but symbolically, the public museum is an institution of modernity. The people own the objects of taste in which they cast judgments, That's the focus of the institution. And for Kant, the focus is that the judgment of taste is not that of a peculiar group of enlightened viewers, but that everyone produces aesthetic judgments, and that mine can be judged against yours, can be judged against everyone else's. So there is a marvelous close link here between Kant's account of aesthetic judgment and his politics. It's a misfortune that Kant's third critique appears in old age, when he doesn't really develop all of this material systematically. And so some of the commentators that I want to cite have played with some of these ideas. You might think of it something like this, that the Public Art Museum provides a space in which there can be open discussion, and open discussion is the process for Kant by which enlightenment can advance. Now, let me just show a couple of the commentators that deal with this, and I'll read one more that's not on the PowerPoint. These are recent accounts on Kant, and you can see how various commentators are playing with this ideas. Maybe the one playing with it most interestingly is Hannah Arendt, who writes in her own book, which is unfinished, quote, "The public realm is constituted by the critics and spectators, not by the actors or the makers. The spectator is not involved in the act, but he is always involved with his fellow spectators." You see, this brings out the very important idea that the aesthetic judgment is essentially social. It's essentially me looking my judgment with other people. This is another one of the Kant scholars. Now, the Kant scholars are not the people to focus on the history of the museum or the contemporary art world in the way that Pizarro and I am, but I think you can see how a lot of the literature is dealing with these issues. Aesthetic judgments in one way, you might say, are like voting. That is, no one can legitimately represent you. Other people may be more knowledgeable or wiser, but that doesn't give them the right to represent you. You have to remember that Kant was a great reader of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and often people are puzzled by Rousseau's insistence on direct democracy, the claim that representation is never legitimate. But if you take seriously this idea that you have to make your own choices, then that should be unsurprising. Now, let's apply this to the art museum. Experts may make better judgments than the public. They may know more. But it's also true that the experts disagree among themselves, and over time, expert opinion changes. For Kant, the claim that the expert can improve on my aesthetic judgment makes no sense. No more than it says that someone can make my political choices for me. Either I'm free to judge or I'm not. In a democracy, you have to choose for yourself. In an enlightened art world, you must make your own aesthetic judgments. And once you give up the notion that expert opinion is privileged, then there's no reason to believe that experts can make better judgments. Now, here we have, of course, from slightly earlier, 1784, Kant's famous phrase about enlightenment. And he goes on to say things that we can apply to the art world. Of course, if people were enlightened, they would see the right policy. Of course, if the curator only could tell me what to do, then I would make better judgments. Not so, Kant says. Now, under the old regime in Europe, in China, the art world was ruled from the top down. There were the experts and there was everyone else. But what defined modernism was the Kantian belief that everyone's judgments counted equally. That's why the link between political democracy and modernism is so important. And that's why the birth of modernism, you see, creates this division between the high art in the galleries and museums and the mass art, the popular art or kitsch. Our art world is ruled by experts, the authorities who make the choices. If you look at other art forms, it's interesting that experts don't play that role. If you look at movies, pop music, or TV, then we all rely on our own judgments. You don't think that there's an expert who tells you which movie is good. You have your own opinion. But it's very interesting that when people go to a museum, they feel like they can't simply look at Poussin or Pollock or contemporary art for themselves. They have to, as it were, bow down to the expert. In the pre-modern world, judgments of taste were thought to be objective. The elite knew what was valuable, and they knew that their tastes were grounded in the structure of the world. It's the kind of Neoplatonic theories that I think you're familiar with. So Kant is the great philosopher who expresses the idea that all people have taste, and all have a right to exert, to cultivate their taste by free access to public museums. Now, if you want to trace this sociology, it's very interesting to look at what was happening in Paris 25 years before the Critique of Judgment was published, namely public exhibitions of contemporary art in the Louvre. And I show what, so this is the 1760s, and I show one of the accounts here by the art historian Thomas Crow. Crow doesn't mention Kant, but you can see how the ideas of what is enlightenment are absolutely filtering through this account, right? Because what is the thrust of this? It's to say no longer do we think that the judgment is simply top-down, we rather think that there is something called a public, and that the public has to judge. And this is at least an ideal, what we have in the modern art world. Now, the distinction, if you will, is between the world of Louis XIV. He didn't like the Bernini sculpture of him, so he exiled it. And the modern world where, when the public in New York didn't accept the Richard Serra tilted arc, the sculpture was removed. Now, within the art world, there are elaborate debates about what's better and worse art. But wild art doesn't even fit within the art world at all. It's interesting. I show here an example, this sort of a trick example. This is a well-known painter, Camille Pissarro, okay? This is a wild artist, recent American who died, named Thomas Kincaid. Now, Kincaid, according to the art world, is not an artist at all. Now, I stress, not that he's not a bad artist or whatever, but that he's simply not good enough to count as an artist at all, in the slightest. Or here we have someone like Bouguereau. Well, similarly, he's not going to be an artist. Let me have to go back slightly, because I've got a couple slides out of order, but that's all right. I can do this. It's interesting how earlier critics talked about this. Roger Fry has a classic essay. He says, let's take Monet. Monet, we all know, is a great painter. Okay? Then we have a Sargent. Sargent is not an artist at all. He is merely an illustrator. Now again, I stress, not a bad artist, because within the art world, as you know, walking through the galleries, there's plenty of bad art, but it's as if the distinction between good and bad art world art is in one place, and the wild art, you see, like Sargent here, or like Kincaid, is in another place. It's simply not art at all. Or take another example, American artist Leroy Neiman. He's an illustrator. He's simply not in the art world. He simply can't be. And it's interesting how the art world people are quite clear that if you look at wild art and you admire it, there's something kind of wrong with you. We had, in the process of doing the book, one of our assistants actually, who is an artist, likes Kincaid, and had a dialogue over vodka with an art historian who could not understand this. You see, it wasn't like, well, we have two different opinions in a Kantian way. He said, well, people like Kincaid or not. I mean, is it different from Pissarro? Well, maybe it's I don't know. But this art historian was simply aghast at this idea that this artist could be liked at all. It's interesting to compare the art world to other top-down institutions. Look at the example for me, certainly of the Catholic Church. There's a tension between relying on public opinion and centralized authority. The popes use airplanes and cell phones, but aim to create the theological power In a similar way, in the art museum, there's a tension between the desire to compete to please the public and a feeling that, that there are still experts. Now, what are we arguing here? We're certainly not saying that all this wild art is good, nor is all the art world art good. Here's Bouguereau, there are lots of bad Bouguereaus, but there are good ones too. There are good Cézannes, there are bad Cézannes. Now, obviously Pizarro and I, you have to think of our context. I mean, we're people who occupy endowed chairs, who are sort of within the art world. We, in a sense, are the establishment. We've published exhibition catalogs and so forth. So, it's not as if this is the revolt from the outside, but this is people from the inside looking critically at the art world institutions. We're very fond of this quote from Kant, in which he invokes the authority of Rousseau, who made him aware of this, if you will, this need for this thinking democratically about aesthetic judgments. I have a little more philosophical material, but I wanted to end in just a second here and go and give lots of examples, because I think that this historical analysis needs to be connected to examples of the wild art. This is from a very late text, the Lectures on Anthropology, 1798, in which Kant offers these four principles. And this relates to my theme of the lecture. When I speak of Kant's aesthetic anarchism, Kant, of course, wasn't a political anarchist, but he should have been an aesthetic anarchist because of his basic principles. Now, I close with one example, and then we'll switch PowerPoint and do a lot more examples. This is a story that interests Pizarro as a former MoMA curator a lot. The man at the top is an Italian-American guy with a shoe shine stand. His name is Joe Malone. And a very great American artist, Louise Bourgeois, thought this was fabulous. And she asked the founding director of MoMA, Alfred Barr, to take it into the museum. Alfred Barr did that. Alfred Barr was having problems with the director, with the chief of trustees already. The chief of the trustees took one look at the shoe-shine stand, kind of a Baroque apparatus here, could not stand this, and so Barr, the founding director of MoMA from 1929, was fired. He was given a kind of desk job set by the front as sort of adjunct curator, something like that. The shoe-shine stand was never displayed by the museum. It's very interesting. You see this, what this example reveals about museums and taste. And in this case, you see interesting the refusal of a chair of the trustees to accept the aesthetic judgment of his director. Now let me see if I can switch to PowerPoint and let's see, I'll go down to the other one and then we can look at some examples. It's a right, I'm sorry, how do I?
Yeah, sure.
It's just right, okay. Now I open that one. Let's see, it's Turin 2. Yeah, oh, thanks. Yeah.
This one? Okay.
Okay, let's see. I got that. There we go. Okay. I give a few quotes of Kant. This is some of the material I presented earlier. These, I think the conceptual things are familiar here. And here's the basic critical system. But let me give some of the examples here. And I give just some of the many categories because I think you have to see that our project, you see, there are going to be two books. The Wild Art is the one forthcoming. The other one is the Kant and museum material that has to be still has to be worked out in final detail. One example would be street art. We're familiar with murals like this, or the things, the graffiti on subways, lots of New York examples, or in Eastern European, this kind of example. The project, when it got going over these 5 years, involved 4 assistants who were graduate students, and they were great because they found examples that Pizarro and I wouldn't have thought of performing here in public. This is an interesting recent example. It's an taking up to date of Alfred Barr. And he's really doing these categories with a vengeance, in which any possible kind of art is going to be extended in this great art historical scheme. Now, in a way, what Joachim and I would say is that this is a sort of reductio ad absurdum of the claim that you can really find a sort of neat structure. This is someone within the art world. This is American artist David Hammonds, who was selling these snowballs in the street of Harlem. Here is an example from Istanbul of all the art in the street. Here's an interesting example in the American art world that there was this guy who had parked this van in Chelsea and said, well, you can go into the galleries and buy art. That's really expensive. Or you can come into my truck and I'll do something for you here. It's revealing about the art world is sensitive to these boundaries between what's inside and outside. There was one case where I saw this guy was selling art on the street, and he wanted $100, and I thought, well, maybe $19.95 would be okay, $100 a little much. But the gallery actually called the police, as if, you see, there was a fear that people would get confused with the art in the Grand Chelsea Gallery and the art that someone was selling on the street in a different context. Here is someone making these kind of details. Lots of this street art in China, as here, lots of things like this. Now, once Pizarro and I got going, you see, we found that the art world claims that the boundaries between what's inside the sort of membrane and what's outside are rather rigid, but actually they're not. And I think you can see how lots of things you find on the street, well, where do they fit? Well, this Trempealeau art, if it was in a Roman church, it would be fine. But you see here in the street, well, it's just street art. It doesn't belong within the art world. We'll look at an example like this. So getting people that are doing very different kinds of conditions. So here, there's someone in Beijing who's writing with water. Interesting example if you think of China and censorship, because there's the writing and the writing disappears before your eyes. Well, lots of graffiti. Graffiti is a great example because it's so international. Look at this example of the Michelangelo that someone did on the New York, in the 1980s on the New York subways. This is a nice example because it comes from a strange place. In the 1980s, the American painter Frank Stella, who belongs very much inside the art world, published a book defending abstract painting, in which he argues how his own painting fits into the whole history of, in particular, he was interested in Caravaggio. But the cover of the book, which gives the title, is called Working Space, and the cover comes from graffiti. He doesn't give any source, so we don't know where that came from. It's a very interesting case because in the 1980s in New York, there was a lot of graffiti everywhere. You couldn't help see it, getting on the subway, walking in the streets, and yet, though the curators were aware of it, the curators wear sort of blinders, and as if you go and you want to go see what's in MoMA or the Met, but you don't want to see what's on the street. Well, this is a form of art too. Another form. And here are other examples of graffiti. Well, here's a crossover figure, Keith Haring, who made the things on the street, but then, of course, got into the art world. There were more examples. I'm just showing lots of examples. Here's an interesting artist, Ellen Harvey, who is an art world artist, and what she was involved in doing was going to the rougher parts of New York City and doing these small paintings, as kind of 18th, 17th century landscapes on the street as a kind of project, which generated lots of complicated interactions you could imagine with the passers-by. Or look, you see at street art like this, or like this. Very inventive kind of category for someone doing art like this. This is a nice example. This involves, because normally graffiti is always removed quickly, this involves scraping down the wall, and so, in a sense, to remove it, you have to clean the whole wall, so versus the process. Or a Chinese artist who's very involved with this. Or here's an example we were looking at that's in Tiziano's new book of you see, of street art. Here, you see an Italian example. Or look at what someone's doing with McDonald's arches. Or is it here? Or this is in Chernobyl. People did street art. Or this is a joke about socks, that you lose one sock and you've got the other, and kind of this art. Or you see lots of street, of course, lots of street art is political in one way or another. Fascinating. This is this English mysterious artist Banksy. See, he went to Mali and did this kind of piece, or did other pieces like this. I just want to, and this is a New York subway example made of plastic bags, and so when the subway comes along and the air comes through the ventilation system, then the dog inflates. Or here's someone who ingeniously installed in New York a bench. You see that he dressed himself up like a street worker, but the bench is art because it's too high to sit on, right? Or here you see more examples. Or the yarn, you see, covering the buildings. Or this was a Wall Street, you see, covering the Wall Street emblem. Or this was a Polish example of an artist, I forget the name here, who got in this big apartment flat in Warsaw, all of the people to, in unison, you see, to turn off their lights, so for this millennium they could have this work of art. Or other examples, or examples like this. Now, here are some of our categories, and again, the richness of the project as it developed involved looking at lots and lots of examples, and I want to stress that it's not like these examples are, you know, are some formula, that they involve some fixed list. It's just examples that we found a convenient way to and here's some more even, you see, to categorize. All of what they all have in common is they all are wild art. Skin art, a lot of ouch stuff, which of course the publisher encouraged us to present because those things are eye-catching. Oh, these people, what did they do? There are art world people who do this kind of body modification, but you see, if you do something like this, you're kind of outside of the art world. Animals, there are animals making art. Here, different sort of animals making art, and then all kinds of things of works of art, the dog grooming. Now, the dog grooming, it can be a parallel universe, but it's not something that's going to allow in the art world. Cars are really great, especially in America. Car country, people like to customize the cars in all sorts of ways. You have the airplane art, the same category. We've got interested in lots of rides, the surfer, of course, the skateboarder. Skateboarding is probably I'm telling you things you know, a highly developed aesthetic world. And one of the assistants in the book early on, it turned out that her husband had a collection of skateboards. And I came over to their apartment, and there was a place, there was barely room for a small table to eat and a bed, but the fairly small apartment was filled with 300 skateboards, one after another. And it was just like connoisseurship. It was like someone saying, well, we have all these Baroque drawings, this one is better than this one, this one. We had skateboard after skateboard after skateboard. So here we have a category, rides, all kinds of bikes, culinary art, all kinds of food art. Aestheticians have theories about why food doesn't count. There's a lady in Central America, in the United States, Iowa, who sculpted from butter. Well, we know you can't do that. Or candy rice made of rice. Or you see things made of other materials of all sort. We got erotic art. This is an example from Andrea Fraser. Well, she's within the art world. The publisher made us push back some of the erotic examples. It was going to restrict the market. But that's certainly a very interesting case where within the art world the rules about what you can do with erotic art, and outside the art world the rules are different. Toilets, it turned out, is a great category. Now it's in the art world, of course we have Duchamp and all of his successors, but there are other examples. This is a fascinating example of a men's toilet here, and this women's firm, you see, having this mural up. Now, this can be an example, you see, to play with and illustrate all of our theory, because I don't want to keep too long here, that this is wild art. I mean by it that it's a product of design that's out there. It's a business presenting it, but it's not in a gallery or a museum. Now, you see, all of the thesis, I could use any one of these examples, but let's use this one. Now, we all know that this kind of play with gender uncertainty or undermining man's confidence and so forth, that there's lots of art world art that does this. This is a cliche. You go to any large show and you find this sort of examples. This, however, is not art world art. It's outside. What is the difference in kind? Now, what Pizarro and I want to say is that any of these wild art examples could move into the art world. There's nothing to prevent someone from having a show of skateboards or food art or whatever. In that sense, the boundaries are open, they're permeable, but there still are boundaries, there are distinctions. We got interested in, here's an artist who makes these paintings, Monet-like, you see close up from little bits of garbage. There's lots of art. Trash turns out to be a big category of art. Lots of people who like to make stuff from refuge. Architecture was an interesting category. This is this corn palace in the American Midwest, made all of corn. Here's Mona Lisa on a farm in Wisconsin. Or here you have, you see, eccentric kind of architecture, or here. Ice and sand are interesting because festivals involve making very elaborate constructions. A lot of interesting Chinese examples there. And also sand art. Now, what's wrong with sand art? Well, it's not permanent, it doesn't count. It certainly can be elaborate, but it's not something you can find in the art world. We had parades, and here we love this quote from Rousseau, which again focuses on the populist side of the Kantian analysis. You may not think of Kant ordinarily as a populist, but that's the kind of way we were going to read him. There is an American festival that Pizarro and I are too old or whatever to know about, called Burning Man. It's held in Western America in the desert. It's an enormous festival. Tens of thousands of people go every year. People's whole life involves preparing for this big festival. You dress up, you make art and so forth. Outside of the art world, doesn't fit there. All kinds of festivals, all sorts of festivals in Berlin. This is a Manhattan phenomenon. This is the Naked Cowboy in Times Square. You see performing even in winter, or the fire eating. All kinds of entertainment. One of the more bizarre aspects of China, I taught there a few years ago, and you go to Macau, and they have, my assistant didn't understand why it was so fascinating. The casino in Macau is built by an American casino owner from Las Vegas. In Las Vegas, there's a copy of Venice. In Macau, there is a copy of Las Vegas of Venice, a double copy. And so you can see the Grand Canal, though it has no churches, only stores and a gambling casino. And you can see in a fake canal Chinese gondoliers who sing O Sole Mio, not quite the right song, and also Chinese classics, okay? Yeah, but they push you in a gondola. I mean, a Chinese-made copy of a Las Vegas copy of a Venetian gondola. We have all kinds of festivals of all sorts, the kind of constructions of a festival on top of a building here. religious art is really interesting because, and this is a part of the book that we downplayed in the final version. If you think about, and James Elkins has a whole book on this that I recommend. If you think about contemporary art, it's very interesting that contemporary religious art, in America at least, is sort of a non-category. What I mean is this, is here you've got, you know, as a sort of middle America. Why not? Why can't Christ be a quarterback? But you sort of know that in the American art world, you can do religious art, but only if you're sort of giving a finger to Christianity. You can't do straightforward religious art. Why not? Well, because that's not something that belongs within the art world. This kind of image, it's kitsch. Now, why is it, you see, it's very interesting. Why is it that a 17th century painter, whatever his or her personal beliefs, could make religious art, and nowadays you can't? I showed the Caravaggio to remind you because this is a kitsch example, I say, where this artist has taken the Caravaggio, the Doubting Thomas scene, and turned it into someone, you see, playing with the painting here. This, again, in the American category, has to be kitsch, it can't be art. We're interested in very small things and very large things. Another category, the carving of Mount Rushmore. And then we looked at kitsch itself, and we like this quote from Todorov. It's really a critique of this whole notion. We might talk about this. Kitsch is really interesting because it's in America at least, a political category. Kitsch is kind of populist stuff, and it's bad because it's, again, too easy and too popular. Norman Rockwell, interesting American painter. Recently they tried to push him into the art world. When I was young, we were taught this was kitsch and it could never belong in the art world. Here, kitsch, or kitsch, as a Scottish painter, he's very big, he's very successful. Jack Vetriano, but can this belong in the art world? Could you hang this in a museum? Could you put this in Venice? No, maybe not. Or Botero. Botero is an interesting case because very successful. We're always taught it was kitsch, but when he did these paintings of the American human rights violations in Iraq, then he could enter the art world. Very interesting. So you see, the division between art world art and wild art, it can even be within a single artist. This is kitsch, wild art, whereas this is art world art. Interesting dilemma. Well, let me end with the lesson from Kant here, because I've gone on for an hour, and I'd love to see if there are any questions about this. Thank you, by the way. Thank you very much.